Good evening, everyone. My name is Sabrina, and I'm co-regional coordinator of the Mid-Atlantic along with John Clark. There are 13 regional coordinators, and we support group leaders, liaisons, chapter expansion, and regional conferences. My family came to this country when I was 8 years old from what was then known as Rangoon, Burma. My very appreciative parents thought that one way for us to give back to this country was to have all three of their children become scientists, because they thought scientists could help solve our country's problems. My siblings and I all obediently earned PhDs in physics and chemistry. So through graduate school, work, and my siblings, I know a lot of PhD scientists. However, I did not know any PhDs capable of going beyond examining climate data into the realm of integrating economics and articulating and strategizing an effective bipartisan climate policy into our complex policymaking process until I met Daniel Richter. I've had the pleasure of knowing Dr. Danny Richter for 5 years and am more impressed each year with his ability to decipher what matters most out of an overwhelming amount of information. Danny is father to 2-year-old Mira, and Mira's sibling-to-be, a great dancer, a great surfer, and wise beyond his years. Please join me in welcoming our wonderful Vice President of Government Affairs, Dr. Danny Richter.
That's it, I've peaked. 1,500 people clapping for me, I can just give up. Thank you, Sabrina, for that very, very kind introduction. That was wonderful, thank you. And thank you all for that very kind welcome. Let me welcome you to the first CCL International Conference where we have a bill in Congress that we're going to be lobbying on. Pretty sweet. So just want to orient you to a couple of things. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be going over our bill passage strategy. I'll go over the one-page leave-behinds and the supporting asks. I'll talk about some things that are likely to come up on Tuesday, and then I'll finish with some thoughts on how we might consider our current situation. But before I do any of that, I just want to orient you to a few things. Number one, of course, this is the first time that we've been on the Hill with the bill introduced, and that is a very, very, very different lobby day. I think it's going to be a lot more fun. Second thing, we are still in a bipartisan Congress. Republicans control the Senate, Democrats control the House. This means that if we want to pass something this Congress, it needs to be bipartisan. And I also want to remind you that in the Senate, that bar is just a bit higher. We are going to need to beat that vote. We're going to get that vote for cloture. We need 60 votes in the Senate, and that means double-digit Republicans in the Senate. So let's talk about our strategy. How are we going to pull this off? Let's start with the most tangible thing, that is the bill, that is in the House. And I've gotten a question several times, which is, will our bill pass the House? And my answer is, in order for the bill to pass the House, it needs to get serious consideration in the Senate. And the reason for that is Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Speaker Pelosi was there in 2009 when cap and trade was seriously considered. It actually passed the House by 1 vote. And then we didn't talk about climate in the Congress for a decade. There were no bipartisan bills until ours was introduced. So I'm going to agree with Speaker Pelosi on this one. I don't think that we should be rooting for our bill to pass the House until there is serious consideration of our bill in the Senate as well, because I don't want to wait another decade to do this again. So what rises to the threshold of consideration? What does it mean for the Senate to consider our bill? Well, first thing, it needs to be introduced in a bipartisan way. Things that would merit consideration would be having hearings on it, adding a significant number of Republican co-sponsors, and of course going to a vote on the floor. I will also say that the threshold of serious consideration will vary from person to person and politician to politician, so we're going to have to play that by ear. While we're on the topic of the Senate, let's talk about Democratic presidential candidates, several of whom are senators. And I know a lot of you have already been interacting with presidential candidates. As someone who has lived in California and Maryland, this has never been an opportunity I've really had, but I know our folks in Iowa and New Hampshire, you can't walk through town without running into a presidential candidate. So do we want presidential candidates to be talking about our bill? Let's think through the scenarios here. Most of them are going to lose the nomination. In fact, there's only going to be one of them who gets the Democratic nomination. And so if the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act becomes very closely associated with one of them and that person loses, we risk our bill developing the reputation of being a loser within Democratic circles. I don't want that. Let's say we get lucky and the winner embraces our bill and they carry the nomination. Well, then you have to consider what happens to any presidential candidate who gets the nomination. Pretty much reflexively, every Republican in the country is going to be against whatever they're for. And so I am concerned about a lose-lose with Democrats embracing the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. What I do want them talking about is climate. I want them talking about climate a lot. I want them talking about carbon fees and even carbon taxes. I'm even okay with them talking about it a lot. I just want them to do their own plans. Leave this one. Let's get Francis Rooney some more company before we start entering this into the presidential discussion. Of course, we're not going to attack their bill, their ideas, because that's just not what we do. If you are meeting with the presidential candidate, that could be something you consider. We're going to say only nice things about your proposal. Please don't attack our proposal. Another thing, if we're going to get to double-digit Republican votes, this cannot become a political football. We need to make climate a bridge issue. And the way we do that is by getting to the hearts and minds of the Republican base. Those of you who have been to these events in the past have heard me talk about this. I've cited the work of Bruley et al. From the Journal of Climatic Change in 2012, which found correlation, although not necessarily causation, between elite cues, they meant Republicans in office, talking about climate like it's something real and we need to address, and what the public believes about climate. Even though it's just correlation, not necessarily causation, it was the best we could do, so we've been going for that. The Republican Climate Resolution, the Climate Solutions Caucus, those were largely, in my mind, about sending those elite cues. This bill is also about sending those elite cues, and we want to continue to see those elite cues. I'm feeling better about causation, basically, because I think that we have seen in this Congress, in the hearings that have happened in the Science Committee, in the hearings that have happened in the Energy and Commerce Committee, the questions that Republicans are asking, the witnesses that they're calling, large portions of the Republican Party in the House are moving away from trying to avoid this problem. I think that's great. Another thing, I'm thinking about how we change the hearts and minds of the Republican base. I'm looking at Dr. Celia Paris, who was our February 2018 speaker. You can still see her presentation online. And what she reminded us of is that bipartisanship is still what the American populace wants to see. We saw this as recently as just a couple of weeks ago when the Climate Leadership Council worked with the Luntz and they put out that poll that found that 80% of voters want a climate solution to be bipartisan. 80% of voters wanted to see a bipartisan climate solution. Dr. Paris encouraged us to remind members of Congress that they do serve this role of providing elite cues. And we listened to her, and you'll find some of her recommendations in our main ask for the Senate. She asked us to remind politicians that opposite party voters like legislator better when he or she engages in bipartisan cooperation, and that they suffer no penalty from same party voters. And that she also asked us to remind them that bipartisan legislators are seen as listening to voters and less self-interested. That is, real benefits to their reputation. This also increases public support for policy. And this gets back into bridge, not wedge. Legislation that is not bipartisan can be repealed. It is extremely subject to becoming a partisan football, and that is something that we just can't afford anymore. We need to make this a bipartisan issue. I always find it useful to check in with the numbers, and so let's check in with the numbers. In order for a bill to pass the House, you need to have a majority. That's 219 votes. In the Senate, right now, for this kind of legislation, you're going to need to beat the filibuster. That is, get a vote for cloture. That's 60 votes. And then if a bill is to become law, that needs to be signed by the president. It is a very real possibility, I would say a probability, that this president would veto that bill. And so if you want to get it signed into legislation to override that veto, you need a 2/3 majority. That's 290 votes in the House, and that is 66 votes in the Senate. Now, Trump does value deal-making, so maybe, but let's not make that our plan. So looking at the math of the Senate, you can't get to 60 votes in this Congress or in the foreseeable future Congresses without 13 to 20 Republicans in the Senate. So again, if we fail at making climate a bridge issue, we lose. The climate loses. That is why make climate a bridge issue, not a wedge issue, is our main ask in the Senate. And the next sentence of that main ask is, we believe the best way to do this is by supporting the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act when Senator Coons reintroduces it. So how are we going to do this? I'm going to put this in the context of our 5 levers of political will. Number 1, lobbying. What do we, the 1,500 people in this room, need to do on Tuesday on the lobbying thing? We need more co-sponsors. We need more co-sponsors, Democrats and Republicans. Republicans will be especially helpful, but we're looking for both. We also need to get a bipartisan bill introduced in the Senate. Those are our lobbying priorities. Grass tops. I want to see more endorsements and more statements of support. We want it to become embarrassing for a member of Congress not to be a co-sponsor of our bill. So if you think of yourself as a member of Congress, think about them. What is their point of embarrassment? If you have former Republican governors and state legislatures, if you have the top employer in the district, if you have a lot of faith traditions in the district, and you have the local T-ball association, all of whom are writing statements of support or endorsements for our bill, I think you as a member of Congress would be embarrassed not to be on that bill. Even the T-ballers are doing it. So I want you to think about, what is your member of Congress's point of embarrassment, and how do you help them get to that point? In a loving CCL way, of course. One of the things that we have provided for you in your packet is it talks about who already supports this bill. And we have statements of support, their own words, from the Environmental Defense Fund, from Trout Unlimited, from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and for the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. We have an environmental group, a sportsman's group, a faith tradition, and a business group, all of whom are saying the right things, and we provide a link to where they can find more statements of support. I think that that is going to be really important, and I put that in the grassroots category. And I also want to say this is general. The specific is, in a lot of cases, maybe even most cases, going to be what really carries the day. So for all of you who have been doing the hard work of getting endorsements in your local district, and especially those of you who are bringing those endorsements here today, thank you. That was really smart, and I think that that will be a really important piece of your meeting. Next piece, media. We want to publicize the support we have and earn and make sure that members of Congress see it. And increasingly, and this feeds back into the last point, this can be broader than just our message. This can be about messengers. One of the frustrations that we've had recently is how much attention the Climate Leadership Council is getting, especially when they don't have a bill introduced, and we do. It's frustrating. We love them. They work well with us. We work well with them, but it is frustrating. And when I reflect on this, what they have done from the very beginning, even without specific policies, they have had messengers. Their message has been their messengers. These statements of support, these endorsements, they are our messengers. So let's increasingly think about how can we make our messengers our message, because it seems to be working. Grassroots. We need to build our local machines. In particular, I'd like to focus your attention on being able to generate a lot of calls quickly. This is related to the Dialing Congress program, which is already having success. It is a slower drip, but already we're finding that aides are starting to remember the bill name and the number when we call. And those of you who have already engaged in this Dialing Congress program, you are going to be the anchors for when we need to create not a drip, but a torrent of calls. And you're going to be in a position to train others on how to do that and have success. The last one, group development. Another key thing in that Luntz poll was that 75% of Republicans under 40, and I'll quote here, would support a bipartisan climate solution that charges fossil fuel companies for their carbon emissions and gives all the money directly to the American people through a quarterly check. 75%. Our check would be monthly, but I don't think that that was what drove the 75% in that poll. So I'm going to take that, and I'm going to say there are a lot of Republicans under 40 who you could probably recruit to your group and who could probably be very effective messengers in your meetings moving forward. So let's keep an eye out for them. And then also with group development, please invest in each other. This is hard work. It's a hard politics. It's really tough. And you guys are all doing it. You're doing an amazing job. So continue to invest in relationships, continue to invest in each other. Let's look out for each other. So next I want to talk about something that I struggle with, and this is the urgency of the problem and my inability to think clearly when I feel under pressure. And so the analogy I would use is I am no good at playing chess when a fire alarm is going off. And the fire alarm of climate is going off, but I need to be able to block that out somehow, and I need to do my best strategic thinking. I need to win that chess game if I'm going to turn off that alarm. We all do. And I'm not going to really give you an answer here, because I think that how you manage this tension, how you honor the urgency of this issue, while also honoring your human need to have space to think, I think that's going to be different for every person, but I just want to acknowledge that that is a tension, and by acknowledging it, I hope that that gives you some traction where you can start to work on it and figure out how that applies to you in your advocacy. And I want to apply this to the question of when. When will the time arrive? When will our bill finally be considered? And I want to lay out two scenarios. The first scenario is the tsunami scenario, where it is considered this Congress, goes to a vote this Congress. And then there's the long slog scenario, where it's the next Congress or even future Congresses. Obviously, the tsunami scenario is preferable, all right? We all want the tsunami to come. We all want that wave to come, and we all want to get the climate solution passed as quickly as possible. But the strategic decisions we might make, if we believe that's going to happen, might be different than if we believed it was going to be further into the future. I think we need to make decisions that make us more competitive in both the tsunami and the long slog scenario. And so when I hear groups talking about 2020, to me that signals they have given up on the tsunami. And to me, that does not honor the urgency of the problem. And so that's why we have always our time frame is always as soon as possible. But we have to acknowledge the more likely scenario, Vegas, they're putting their money on future Congresses. We're going to do our best to show them wrong. But we're also going to make sure that we take actions that mean we're well positioned in the case that they were not wrong. And I think that the way we do that is we earn the inside track. I'm using a lot of analogies, but it's me. So what do I mean by earning the inside track? Inside track, the runner on the inside track has an advantage, and they get that advantage by having the best time in the races before. How does that translate to this? The way we earn the inside track is by getting the most co-sponsors, by getting the most statements of support, by having the most people on the ground, and having all these studies ready. Think about what would happen if you were not as far as we are. Think if you're a member of Congress, you want to have the climate solution. You need to figure out a bill, you need to write it, you need to get it through legislative council, you need to get someone on the other side of the aisle to get where we are to agree to that language. Then you need to get double-digit members of Congress. Right now we have 10%. We have 10% of all members of the House are co-sponsors on our bill, 1 in 10. They need to get to that point. Then they need to line up all these sponsors outside of that. They need to do studies. And at a certain point, it's just not going to be worth it. So what I want us to do, what I mean by earning the inside track, we want to become the default. We want to become the easy, good solution. So even the laziest member of Congress looks at all the things that we've done, how we've reached their point of embarrassment, and they can just go, and become a co-sponsor, and we'll be like, oh, that's great, good job. That was the laziest member of Congress, but that was the best thing they could do for the climate. So that's where we want to get, because we do have a good solution. And this is also why why we have gotten, I've been more comfortable with having this great disparity between Democrats and Republicans. With these Democrats, we are earning the inside track. We are making it easy in future Congresses to say, look, you've already got 10% of the Congress. For Nancy Pelosi, we are just a few members shy of being 1/5 of her caucus. 1/5 of her caucus. Is she going to lay the boom on 1/5 of her caucus? Is she going to slam that? Including some of the most progressive members of her caucus, including some of the most conservative members of her caucus? No, she is not. That's not the inside track, but we're getting there. We're getting there. And so on Tuesday, I want you to think about earning the inside track. So we're going to have lots of time for questions, but I want to go through the supporting asks and the leave behinds. So I've already talked about the Senate leave behind a little bit, and so we'll start with that. Again, we need to overcome this. This needs to be a bridge issue. It can't be a wedge issue. So that is our number one ask in the Senate. A couple of other things on there, in addition to the wisdom of Dr. Celia Paris, we've also given you an opportunity to talk about the statements of support, an invitation, if it makes sense to you and your team, to make our messengers the message. And what we're closing with is how we've had success. Over the past 11 years, Citizens Climate Lobby has grown to include over 130,000 committed supporters by emphasizing our values of appreciation and respect. And in today's politics, that is countercultural. Doing the hard work of finding appreciation and respect for those you disagree with is countercultural, but we need it. And so we're reminding members of Congress that their constituents expect them to reach across the aisle on this most important of issues and to embody that, to remember that American value. On the House ask, this one is fairly straightforward. This is basically the one-pager that me and my team walked around the hill with to get this bill introduced in the first place. So we know this works. And you just have some benefits at the top, and you're describing the 4 parts of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. Because 10% of members are already co-sponsors on the bill, and so you'll be meeting with a lot of them. For them, you want to thank them. And you want to invite them to go further. Challenge them to invite one of their colleagues, Democrat or Republican, to be a co-sponsor as well, and to share their thinking why they joined on. So we want to earn that inside track, and they can help us do that even though they're already co-sponsors. Then I want to talk about our supporting asks. And so we have just a few supporting asks. This document, Making a Supporting Ask, 2019 June Lobby Day. The first part of this is just a primer on what asks are, our primary ask and our supporting ask, what they are. Because this is the first lobby day, this has changed so much because thinking about it, we're all reset. You know, if you think about the past 11 years of Citizens Climate Lobby before the bill, we were all at different points. Different groups came online at different points. Now we're all basically the same. When that was introduced in January in this Congress, we all had to tell our members of Congress about it. And so we should all be talking about the bill. And the list of supporting asks, the thought behind those in the past was there are different rungs on the ladder. And if the highest rung wasn't enough for them and the one down, let's go for a lower rung. Those lower rungs are not on these supporting asks. These are all bigger asks. They're all bills that have been submitted. They're all bipartisan. And I want to walk through some of these, and why we chose them. So first of all, CCL is not endorsing these bills, but we do think that they will support our efforts. And part of that is who is supporting these bills in the first place. So consider the Disaster Act. This is in the House. There's a bipartisan group that includes some very conservative members of Congress. And what the bill would do is it would ask the Office of Management and Budget to submit a report on how much money we're spending on disasters. That's going to help us in our advocacy make the case for Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. For the Utilizing Significant Emissions with Innovative Technologies, the Use It Act, this is also bipartisan. This one is bicameral. It's in both chambers of Congress, the House and the Senate. And really interesting here is Senator Barrasso. Senator Barrasso is from the really big coal state of Wyoming. And when he introduced this bill as the lead sponsor, he used climate as part of his justification for why he's doing that. And so if you want to talk elite Qs, that's an elite Q. And that was so surprising that the New York Times reported on that. They wrote an April 30th article on that. And so I want to see more of that, and I want to, if we can get co-sponsors on this, this sends a signal to Republicans like Senator Barrasso that CCL can do great things. CCL can help you move your priorities through Congress, and we're a great group to have around, just in general. And what the Use It Act would do is it would support the development and demonstration of vital carbon capture and removal technologies. We're talking about direct capture, whereas you remove it directly from the atmosphere, as well as point source capture. The next one, the Coastal Communities Ocean Acidification Act. This one, an important point. This is bicameral, it's bipartisan in both chambers. It passed the House already. So last week it passed the House, so even the threat of you guys coming to DC was enough to get this passed, so good job. We're already winning. But Francis Rooney is a co-sponsor of this, of course, as the Republican on our bill. We want to give him as much support as we can. In the Senate, Senator Lisa Murkowski is supporting this, and she, in her role as chairman, she has called the first climate hearing since 2012 in the Senate. Yeah. And we know that ocean acidification is an important concern for her. It is the so-called evil twin of climate change, and this is a big concern for her. So we want to thank people who are sending, again, those elite Qs. A couple that I want to, special ones. So the Florida delegation, you probably heard from Adeline. If you get to the point of making your secondary ask, you've been asked to support Francis Rooney's, again, offshore drilling bill, and that would be our recommendation, but we do still trust you. If you don't get to it or if you want to do something else, you can. And for those of you who are meeting with members of, where did it go? Of the House Science Committee, Taylor Krause should have been in touch with the meeting leads, and the Challenges and Prizes for Climate Act, HR 3100, was introduced Wednesday. And so for those, that's our recommended supporting us. But again, we trust you. And the last one here, speaking of trust, is the Reclaim Act. And this is the one that is most difficult to tie to our legislation. Unless you understand the history of coal country, and I mean the CCL action team. So we always tell you, you can choose your own supporting asks, and we trust you to do that. Well, Jim Probst took me at my word. And he started using the Reclaim Act as a supporting ask. And one day, he kind of sheepishly comes up to me and said, Danny, I don't know if this is allowed, but I've been using this bill, and you know what, our relationships have been improving. And I said, yeah, you can take me at my word. And so and they've been doing great things and doing the really hard work in coal country. And, you know, if you had any doubt, the CCL is still an organization that listens to its volunteers and that follows where you lead. let this bill's inclusion as a supporting ask, one of the 4 bills that we are including as a supporting ask, dispel any doubt. I just want to thank you, Jim, and thank you everybody who's doing the hard but necessary work of working in coal country for all that you've done, and I hope that including this as a supporting ask, an official CCL supporting ask, makes your job easier. One last note, if you were going to make a supporting ask but you haven't consulted with the constituents, there are just a few meetings where there are no constituents, please stick to the main ask. Again, we don't want to do anything that the constituents have not planned, and if you have not confirmed with constituents that they want to make a particular supporting ask, please stick with just the main ask. So now I have some time for questions, and we have cards in the back. There have been cards.
Nope.
There were cards in your folders, and so I believe we're directing questions to the back. And is Stephanie going to ask?
Stephanie and Ben.
Okay, great.
But yeah, your cards are in your folder. So hold them up when you're done, and people will come and pick them up from you. Okay, Danny.
Yeah.
Do you want more Democrats on the Climate Solutions Caucus?
The Climate Solutions Caucus. Let's talk about the Climate Solutions Caucus. I want to see the Climate Solutions Caucus public again. So the paperwork has been filed, so it technically exists. But so far, we do not have positive confirmation about who is on it. We've heard that everybody's on it, but until we can totally confirm that, I think it would be really hard for you to be successful with that ask, and we only want to ask you to do things that we believe you are successful with. And so it is our belief, but again, we need to confirm this, that the Climate Solutions Caucus will be public soon. We will know exactly who is in and who is out, and we will be able to provide specifics on this. But until we have that, I would actually steer away from asking members to join it, because we don't know the conditions under which they would join. Again, I just don't think we have enough information for you to be successful. So I look forward to you making that supporting ask again. But for now, my recommendation is that you hold off.
Danny, there's still people looking for some clarity about the regulatory adjustment. Can you outline exactly what is affected by the regulatory adjustment and what stays and what is not affected?
The only regulations that are paused are the ones that aren't doing anything right now. The ones that remain an important bulwark for reducing emissions, such as CAFE standards, such as the ability to regulate methane leakage from natural gas systems, those are explicitly protected. And I would argue that if this bill were to pass, that the regulatory framework in the United States would be strengthened, because this would be the first time that Congress has said the EPA has the ability to regulate greenhouse gases for their greenhouse gas effects. Right now, we are relying on a Supreme Court decision. And that is something that conservatives who don't want to see regulations, they seize on that, and they make a big point about that. And I think that there is a point to be made there. Congress has never said that the EPA has the ability, clearly, the authority to regulate greenhouse gases. We are relying on a Supreme Court decision. This bill not only says, Congress is saying the EPA does have the authority to do that, but they have the authority to close the gap between what the carbon fee is driving in emissions reductions and the schedule that is laid out in 9903. So that is what is in the bill. It is very circumscribed on the regulatory adjustment.
If our rep has already signed onto the bill, do we still go over the benefits with them?
I would ask them if that's helpful, because in the context of you just ask them to go talk to their colleagues and ask their colleagues to be co-sponsors as well. And so as part of that question, you might say, would it be helpful before you do that, before you reach out to your colleague and invite them to be a co-sponsor with you, for us to go over some of the benefits. I would not just dive right into the benefits. I would assume that they have been convinced by those. So that would be my recommendation there.
Danny, when can we expect a CBO score?
I don't know. It's something that I think has become a lot less important. I do. I think that the reason we put so much emphasis on that in years past is it seemed really, really, really important at the time that revenue neutrality, which means that the government deficit neither increases nor decreases over a 10-year period, that seemed to be a really, really important issue. And it seems a bit less important. I think that this will, and we were also a lot more stuck than we are. And that seemed like an important way to get things unstuck. Things to me seem to be rolling. And so I don't know when to expect it, but it's also not at the top of my worry list. Other questions?
Do you recommend we offer all 4 supporting asks?
No. Laser-like focus is still important, and so my recommendation is that after you have had a chance to move off the main ask, you focus on just one supporting ask. Remember, we're shooting for a 50%, 50-50 split in how much you're talking and how much they're talking. Let's phrase that differently. How much you're listening and how much they're listening. And I think that if you cram too much into a meeting, you set yourself up to fail, to not listen. And so I do not recommend you doing more than one supporting ask.
Danny, for those of us meeting with the chairman of the committees and subcommittee chairs, do we want to ask them to have hearings on the bill?
Given what I said about Speaker Pelosi, I think that has, I don't think so. I think that instead of having hearings specifically on the bill, I think that what we want to be asking is for people to work this into other hearings. And so when there is a hearing on climate, or when there's a hearing on the economy or jobs in the economy or clean tech or whatever, asking co-sponsors in particular to weave this into their remarks, to weave in that this is a bipartisan solution that is a match for the scale of the problem, it's in line with the science and the economics, to make those points, to send those elite cues. I think that is how I would tweak that language.
How is our bill considered revenue neutral if the dividend is taxed?
The only reason it's revenue neutral is because the dividend is taxed. If the dividend is not taxed, this is revenue negative. It increases the deficit. I will refer you to our laser talk on this. It's the CBO and the 25% haircut. This is such a bear to explain. So the person who's asking the question has asked a question. It's been asked so many times, it's a really difficult thing to understand. So I'll make an attempt, but there is a laser talk should I fail for you. But the government assumes that if you raise, let's say you raise $100 billion, they will get less money from, that money's tied up, and it's not being spent on employing people, it's not being spent on investments. Those are places where the federal government also collects tax revenue. And so they anticipate reducing their tax revenue in those places. So if they raise $100 billion, they're assuming that actually you're only raising $75 billion. So that's a 25% haircut, how's it called? Economists can be really boring, I'm sorry. And so it's not a 25% mohawk. I mean, that would be better. It's 25% haircut. And so they're assuming that, so the federal government only has $75 billion, 75% of the revenue. If you return 100% of the revenue as a non-taxable dividend, then the federal government is out $25 billion. And that makes it revenue negative. It is increasing the deficit. The CBO has said, and we cite these publications, they're in the Dividend Delivery Study, for example, that if you make that dividend or that return in this context or other contexts taxable, they will assume that they will make that back. And so it's a very rough assumption, but the only reason our bill is revenue neutral is because the dividend is taxable. It's the only reason.
Danny, is there anything in the Energy Innovation Act concerning liability in oil companies?
There is nothing in the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act concerning liability in oil companies. The status quo would remain as it is. We don't touch that. That's the CLC. It's not us.
Danny, what do you think is a good response to how EICDA plays with the Green New Deal?
I think that a great response is that they're not mutually exclusive, and I would point to the 19 co-sponsors who are also co-sponsors of the Green New Deal resolution, and equally, that means that there are 22 co-sponsors who are not. And I think that what that tells you is that we really, honestly and truly, are capturing a wide breadth of political ideologies within the United States. I think it does no harm to point out that the Green New Deal has brought a lot of attention and energy to this issue, which is welcome. It's really hard to get that. And in case you're a conservative and you're worried about making that point, I first heard that point made by Carlos Curbelo. And so I think the Green New Deal has brought a lot of attention. I think that is to this issue. I think that's fantastic. And the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, there's nothing, the two are not mutually exclusive. They can coexist. And the members of Congress agree with that. We got time for a couple more.
Do you think Republicans are holding off on co-sponsoring EICDA because they're waiting for the Climate Leadership Council bill?
No. They're not. I think the Republicans are having, I think that they're taking as long as they have because they're human beings. And I had this later in my speech, so spoiler alert. But I like to think about the analogy of they have not been talking about climate or really the environment in a positive way, a proactive way, for a very long time. And so those muscles have atrophied. And if you have muscles that atrophy, you need to go to the gym and you need to rebuild them slowly. You do. And so I think that this is another way I think about elite cues. Every time they say climate change is real, Republicans, climate change is real, humans have had an impact, and Congress should do something about it. Even if all they say is we should innovate, they are working out those muscles. It might be that they're really light weights, but they're humans, and it takes time. It just takes time. And I know, and that's again where I think this analogy of how do we honor the urgency of the problem while also honoring our human failings. I do not do my best thinking with a fire alarm going off. That is a weakness, that is a human weakness, but you cannot change that. You cannot change that. And so I think we need to allow for the humanity of Republicans in Congress, and I think we need to respect that. All right, one more question, and then I'll move on to the next section.
Danny, can you explain why the border adjustment will run a surplus, and what could that revenue be spent on?
The border adjustment will run a surplus because of the trade deficit. So I know that President Trump is very concerned about this. He talks about the trade deficit a lot. But all that means is that we import more than we export. But for imports, we're importing more. If you're collecting the border adjustment on those goods as they enter, and you're rebating that back to fewer goods that we export, and it's a fair and equivalent fee for like goods, you expect a surplus. And so that's where the surplus comes from. It is directly related to the trade deficit. And some things that we could spend it on, well, I would highly recommend that we allocate some of that revenue in the bill text, as the bill text does, to paying for the administrative costs. And some other things that could be decided, say in the Senate bill, or say in the markup in committees, or say in the when it goes to conference, you could dedicate that to helping pay for mitigation and adaptation in developing countries. This would be smart with respect to the WTO because there's a WTO principle called common but differentiated responsibility. and that is all nations have a common responsibility to address climate, but it is differentiated based on each country's ability to respond. Basically, how wealthy is that country? And so even though this is in direct opposition to the principle of most favored nation and national treatment, which are also WTO principles, which is why international trade law is not my favorite thing to talk about. I don't like paradoxes. Nonetheless, doing that would help our case. And so that would be one thing you could do, and if you do get that question, you might, and you want to sound really slick, you might point out common but differentiated responsibility, and this is something you could do. And so I'm Danny Richter, blah, blah, blah. All right, focus on Tuesday. Again, we should all be talking about the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, and it should be on the tip of your tongue that it was introduced in the House as H.R. 763, and that it was introduced in a bipartisan fashion in the Senate and the House last Congress. In fact, it finished the last Congress with 4 Republicans and 8 Democrats. Remember, main points to hit about this bill: bipartisan, good for people, good for the economy, effective, and revenue neutral. I also want to go over some common disagreements on this bill from both the right and the left. Let's start with the right. 3 most common disagreements that we've been seeing are, number 1, it's a tax. Number 2, it's wealth redistribution. And number 3, this is the start of a universal basic income. Those are, I'm going to give you one response to each of those. My response is not the only response. It's not necessarily the best response, in particular considering that you know your member of Congress better than I do. But here's one response. Hopefully this will help with those creative juices. So in the response to this is a tax, you might say, what this is doing is this is a pricing pollution appropriately. That's just responsibility. And the dividend gives the most responsible Americans a tax cut. To the issue, it's wealth redistribution. No one is locked into being a winner or a loser in this. Everyone has the liberty to choose whether they win or lose with this bill, and then they have the liberty to change their minds. So this is not wealth redistribution. This preserves liberty of choice. They pay me for some reason. This is the start of a universal basic income. And for those of you who don't know what a universal basic income is, that's the concept that you give everybody in the country a certain amount of money every year, regardless of what else they're doing. And so our point here is a universal basic income would not be self-extinguishing. But this bill envisions its own demise in Section 9905. This is not the start of a universal basic income. From the left, the most common arguments we've heard against this are that it's market-based and the regulatory pause. And so I went over that once, but it is coming up so much, I'll go over it again. So a response to its market-based is that CCL is an organization that listens to experts. We've listened to the experts on the science, and we've listened to the experts on the economy, and the experts on the science and the economy both say that a price on carbon is the fastest way to reduce emissions. We have listened to those experts. For the regulatory pause, first of all, I want to point out that both of these things that the left is complaining about are big selling points with the right. So if you go into Republican office, think about this, both the fact that it's market-based and the regulatory pause, you can go ahead and lead with that. But if you're going into Democratic office and there's a concern about the regulatory pause is the price of bipartisanship. CCL's role in this was to make it circumscribed. Only those regulations that aren't doing anything are paused, and those that remain an important bulwark in the defense of the climate, such as the CAFE standards and the ability to regulate natural gas pipelines from methane leakage, are not paused at all, but protected. Even those regulations that are paused are brought back in the case that the experts were wrong, and that after a period of time that is not too much longer than it would take to write, implement, and pass through the inevitable court challenges, regulations that would be this ambitious, as ambitious as this price. And you could also go into that point I made about how this would be the first time Congress has said explicitly the EPA has the authority to regulate greenhouse gases for the greenhouse gas emissions. Next, I want to cover what is the current state of mind. I want to give you an insight. What is the current state of mind of Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate? Start with Republicans last. We start with Republicans last time. We start with Democrats. In the House, Democrats are doing lots of climate hearings, so climate is definitely on their mind. There is also lots of focus on the president and oversight, and they're exercising their powers of oversight. Presidential candidates are also already starting to influence things, I think that the Green New Deal actually has not been as big of a thing in Congress as it has been in the media or in volunteer advocate circles. So I think it is likely to come up for some of you, but I would not expect it to be as big of a thing as you are finding for many of you in your communities. So that's just a thing to be right there. And again, the main point there, they've done a remarkable job at upping the urgency, and the two are not mutually exclusive. They can coexist, and those 19 co-sponsors prove it. In the Senate, remember, Democrats in the Senate are in the minority still. They're looking for Republicans, and many of them are looking at the presidential race. A few of them are in the presidential race. But because they're still in the minority, there may be some frustration, there may be some resignation, but obviously you still have champions like Chris Coons who are still working hard to make this a bipartisan bill in the Senate as well in the House. For Republicans in the House, they are still adjusting to being in the minority. A large portion of them are searching for a way forward on climate. This will take time, and again, I view them as strengthening their muscles. They're working out how to figure out, how do I maintain my conservative credentials? How do I align with this identity as a conservative? It's very important to me and I value very much while talking about climate. It's just going to take time for them to figure that out. In the Senate, they're going to be really trying to preserve their majority in the coming election. Republicans have to defend 22 Senate seats to 12 that the Democrats have to preserve. Some of them may be looking for solutions on climate. Some of them may view a solution on climate as part of the way they are going to preserve those 22 seats. So I think that there could be some opportunities, but definitely their focus is going to be on preserving their majority in a difficult landscape. Now, next thing, some things that are likely to come up tomorrow. Number one, how does your bill compare to various targets? And the targets that are most salient to members of Congress are going to be the Clean Power Plan and the Paris commitments. And you can just say, we meet both of those. This bill meets both of those. So done, easy. Another thing that is very likely to come up is a dividend. The dividend, this has been a top 5 issue every year I've done the analysis. And most of those, unusually, are questions. They're asking, how does this work? Well, we have a study on that. And so that's the Dividend Delivery Study. And not only does it answer questions that staffers, very smart staffers on the right committees didn't even know they had, it has a lot of very impressive forms that you can tell them accurately are compatible with existing IRS software. So not only can we do this, here are the forms you can use, just photocopying them, changing the number, they're already going to be ready to go with existing IRS software. That's pretty cool. Next, I think that endorsements and statements of support is going to be an interesting thing. It was a top 5 issue last June, coming up in 12% of all meetings. That's 1 in 9. That's when we didn't have a bill. So I do think that there will be a lot of interest in endorsements and statements of support. So be prepared to talk about that. Be prepared to answer questions. And then finally, before we get to more questions, I just want to remind you about who these staffers are. The average age for a congressional staffer is 27. If you make it 3 years on the Hill, you're a graybeard. They frequently work 50 to 70 hours per week, and there have been no staffing increases for House members since the 1970s. So if you're a member of Congress, you have not been able to add staff to deal with the complexity of the 8-track and the minivan. let's forget about the internet and cell phones, all right? So our position is that they are deserving of your appreciation and respect, and you do have a choice about how they see them, and seeing them generously is more likely to get positive results. So now we have another opportunity for questions.
Danny, do we
Yes.
only go to a supporting ask if the MOC, Member of Congress, says no to our primary ask? Please
No.
clarify under what circumstances we should ask about those.
I would describe, so the direct answer, no, that's not the only scenario. I would say it's when you get a clear answer to your request. If they say yes to your request, then you say, okay, good, we're going to hold you to that. Here's our supporting ask. So no, it is not the only scenario. I would say that, yeah, it's once you get a clear answer, once you've listened to them about the reason for their answer, once you've asked your clarifying questions, once you and your group feel prepared to have follow-up steps, then you would move to the supporting ask. So that's what I would say you're looking for.
Danny, what would you say to a Republican representative who's interested in the Energy Innovation Act, but is concerned about losing his seat?
That really depends on why they're concerned about losing their seat. There's a lot of diversity within our country, and there's a lot of diversity in political situation. So if you had a conservative who is concerned about losing their seat in a primary with a challenge from the right, I would talk about messengers. I would talk about all the people, the 3,500 economists who support a fee on carbon with a dividend. I would talk about the statements of support that we have on this sheet. I would talk about messengers. If it is you might also talk about that Luntz poll finding that 75% of Republicans under the age of 40 want to see something like this happen. If it is someone who is in a toss-up seat, they're more worried about their general election, then I would say, this is a good bill for you. This is something that works with swing voters. It works with the voters you already have who are on the right. Like Dr. Celia Paris has told us, those members who are working in a bipartisan way don't lose any support from the folks they already have. They're not going to be punished, and they're more likely to be seen in a positive way by those voters they're trying to win. But a lot of this answer really does depend on the member and the district, and I would make sure that you are always honoring the reality on the ground. All politics is still very oftentimes local.
Danny, can you tell it? Oh, sorry.
My turn.
Jumping ahead.
Danny, I have a really serious one. Do you think it's time to ask everybody for a dance break?
Yes, I think it's time for a dance break. Oh, I can see you now. Stand up.
Danny.
Here.
Mm.
Danny,
Yes.
next question.
Yes.
Does Canada's carbon price include a border adjustment?
Does the which carbon price?
Canada's carbon price include a border adjustment?
Can this carbon price include a?
Canada.
Oh. Does Canada's carbon price? No, I don't. So where's Kathy? I don't want to speak to Canada. Next question. I think they have output-based allocations. I don't think they have a border adjustment. But please check with Kathy.
What is the process for somebody becoming a sponsor if they say yes?
They call up the Deutsche office, say, sup, I want to be a co-sponsor. The Deutsche office is like, dope. Next question.
Danny, can you tell us where to find the bill numbers for the supporting asks?
Yes, you can find the bill numbers of the supporting asks. They are in this handout, the gray pages. All all the supporting asks are listed there. They have the bill numbers right there. They're in your handouts.
Is the mechanism for delivering the dividend specified in the bill?
No. Our assumption with that, so first of all, we were trying to, simplicity has always been a virtue that we've been trying to embed in this process. And one of the ways you can embed simplicity on there is you don't get too prescriptive in the text. And so we do specify limits on how much it should cost. We're clear that who should get it and what share that should be. But the way we envision this playing out is that when it is passed, this bill is handed down to rule makers, and then we give them the dividend delivery study, and that answers the questions they didn't even know they had, and that would be basically what happens. It may or may not be the case, but we're not too concerned about getting that into the legislative text.
What would you consider success for Lobby Day? How many sponsors would you want to see?
This is a loaded question. So the DC staff has a pool on this. And I will tell you that this is for 2 weeks after the conference, and the numbers that I selected, I said 61 Democrats and 3 Republicans. Just in the House.
Danny, can you just repeat your response to the accusation of the bill being wealth redistribution?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Where did that go in my notes? Just give me a second. Wealth redistribution. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So for wealth redistribution, one answer that you might give is that nobody is locked into being a winner or a loser. Everyone has the liberty to choose whether they win or lose, and they have the liberty to change their mind. This is a bill that preserves choice.
Danny, what advice would you give to a nervous first-time lobbyist?
My advice to the nervous first-time lobbyists in the room would be to remember that you're meeting with people. There's not a separate species called members of Congress or congressional staff. Remember that the aides you're meeting with, their average age is 27. And so think about, and the other thing I would point out is they have to be nice to you. You're a constituent. So, I would say that remember they're people, go in there, try and have a little bit of fun, and remember that we're a team. So you're going in there with other people who've done this before, and they know what they're doing. They do work. Yeah.
Danny, just to clarify, HR 763 is based on CCL's proposal and not Climate Leadership's proposal.
Yes.
What is a way to talk about that this is a tax on a profession, or how can we talk about oil workers?
How can we talk about oil workers? How can we talk about that this is a tax on a profession? This is really tough, because the temptation is to go directly into numbers. That's probably not going to go well. I've gone down that path, and it did not go well. I I would reject the temptation to talk about how few jobs there are in coal or oil and gas, or to compare that with renewables. I think that really we probably have a lot to learn from our aforementioned coal country team. And what they're doing is they're investing in, they're talking about the Reclaim Act. Because if you answer too quickly, you might be missing an important part of the message. So first I would ask them to talk more about that. And then depending on the answer, I would respond with the way I view it. And the way I view it, and again, I could amend this depending on how he or she responded, is we had for 8 years the Obama administration, which was doing everything they could to work through the regulatory pathway. They pursued a legislative action first, and then as a second option, a less preferable option, they went all in on the regulatory approach. So after 2010, they went on that regulatory approach. They finalized the plan, the Clean Power Plan, and then it was set to be implemented in 2022. So from 2010 to 2022, that's 12 years. That's 3 Democratic presidents in a row, assuming that it survived the court challenges that were ongoing at the time of the 2016 election. And again, I would frame this from my view. I don't want to wait 12 years, and I don't want to subject myself to a strategy which is so fragile that it can't survive a Republican president. I still think we should pursue it, but I think we should be pulling out all the tools in the toolbox, and I'm really appreciative for all the people and advocates who spent so much time to do that. It was the best option at the time, but we can't make that the only egg in our basket. That'll be my response.
Is there anything in the bill that would impact the Juliana court case?
No.
All right.
Danny, what should we do if a Republican wants to co-sponsor the bill in the Senate, or at least wants to have a deeper conversation?
I really hope that happens. When that happens, and should it happen on Tuesday, what you should do is you should let me know, me or Ben or Andres know, and you should also tell them in the moment. Would you be willing to talk to Senator Chris Coons about this? And our experience with Senator Coons is, Senator Flake came to him to introduce the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act in the last Congress. And there was a news story that broke this week about the good Senator Romney from Utah having a conversation with Chris Coons about the bill. Republican senators like Chris Coons, so and they like working with him. So if you throw out that name as someone who you should talk to, I think that there's a very good chance that they would like to speak with him. But please also let us know. Let's do 2 more questions, unless it's just a one-word answer.
Okay. The bill provides rebates for carbon capture and sequestration. Why doesn't it include rebates for direct air capture?
It doesn't include rebates for direct air capture because there was a concern in the discussion about breaking the bank. If we were to ever get in the wonderful position where direct air capture was so cheap and feasible, you could envision a situation where the amount of rebates due to direct air capture would exceed the revenues in the bill. And so you have a situation where costs going up, people are getting no dividend, but we're sequestering a lot of carbon. And the United States is paying out a lot of money, revenue negative. So while that would be really good for the climate, it was beyond the tolerances for Congress, which of course has the power of the purse. So that's why it's not in there.
Danny, can you speak to the expected administrative costs of HR 763?
I can speak to the administrative costs for the dividend and for the collection of the fee. The collection of the fee will be very, very small. There are as few as 1,200 to 15 entities who would need to pay that fee, most of whom are already paying a fee or a tax to the federal government at a choke point in their production. And then the dividend, we estimate it being quite low. There's also a laser talk on that, which Rick Knight, one of our research coordinators, has written. And we had that before we were advising on this bill, and so the limits on the administrative costs in that were meant to reflect what we thought we could do, what was realistic. The administrative costs for the border adjustment, we don't have any good way of estimating that, because right now there is no existing border adjustment for carbon emissions in the world. So you have 7 out of the 10 largest economies in the world who have carbon prices. None of them have a border adjustment. They are already forcing their companies to eat those costs. And I think that's a good reason why why they haven't gone with greater ambition. And so that we don't know what those costs would be, but also we are hopeful, and the bill is written in a way that we will never have to have a border adjustment. The bill is meant to drive people to the bargaining table. And this is also good for WTO concerns. It envisions forming bilateral or multilateral treaties where we figure out, you're doing this, we're doing this, let's just call it even. And so it envisions a world where a few years out, that is the case. And so the best case scenario with the border adjustment is we never have to use it, we never have to pay those administrative costs. But yet we don't, so they're really hard to estimate. We don't have a good estimate for those. And this will be the last question.
What should we think about proposals to use a portion of the dividend to fund specific groups?
Specific groups, I guess it depends on what you mean by group. In general, that is not what we are for. And so you stick to our guns, but I think that we are succeeding in earning the inside track. And I think that affords us some latitude to bring more people in and to broaden our coalition. So I think you say, we're for what we're for, and we're for 100% dividend. If this has to be a part of the discussion, we welcome the discussion, but we're not going to advocate to change it in any way until a member of Congress who we need says they need this to support the bill. So we're not going to negotiate with ourselves, but we are going to try and broaden the coalition, and we're going to say clearly it needs to be a member of Congress who forces this discussion. And I will say, what we have said on the Hill and in public, our 2 bottom lines are whatever the final bill looks like, it's got to take a huge chunk out of emissions. And it's got to be good for the bottom 2 quintiles. And those are our 2 red lines. And so if you're above that, then we're going to recommend support. But we're going to try our darndest, and we're not going to change what we've been messaging to you. When this process started, I started with what we had been saying with all of you, and it was only when a member of Congress forced us to negotiate away from that we did in order to get this bill out there. So that's how I would recommend we do that. And so, closing statement. One of the interesting things that I hear in my position is why do we let things happen? Why did we let so many Democrats join our bill? Why haven't we gotten more Republicans to join our bill? Why haven't we gotten more media attention? Why aren't more environmental organizations lining up behind this policy? These are all good questions to ask, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about each of them, and there have been many staff discussions on each of these. But with each of these questions, we're never going to be able to address them with any level of authenticity if we don't account for the role of chaos, of unpredictability, and of wills that have set themselves in opposition to our own. So let me talk a little about each of those. Chaos. It's a busy world out there. Lots of crazy, unpredictable things happen. This affects our ability to plan and our ability to implement the plans that we make. Is there anything wrong with that? I hope not, because it's not exactly something we can change. So better get used to it. Unpredictability. One of the things that I've noticed about DC and American politics in general is how everyone is obsessed with making predictions. They're obsessed with making predictions. And there also seems to be no correlation between how accurate those predictions are and how likely anyone is to listen to future predictions from that same person. As a scientist, I've always found this jarring. It is my view that if you're going to make a prediction, do so with error bars and take the time to evaluate how you did after the fact. And if you have a hypothesis that consistently makes bad predictions, you can go ahead and reject that hypothesis. There are also wills that are set against our own, on the right and on the left for different reasons. There are people who do not want this bill to become law. Not only do they not want it to become law, they are working to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, each of these things can be kind of scary, but they can also be pretty darn obvious. And it makes me wonder if perhaps I and some of the people in this room may have seen too many movies, where somebody makes a plan and then they work the plan and then they save the day, and all in 90 minutes. That sounds like a great deal, but I found it doesn't work that way. The fact is that once the Energy Innovation and Carbon and Dividend Act, our bill, was introduced in last Congress, with 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, we surrendered a lot of control, and we subjected ourselves and our plan to each of these forces in new ways. Is that a problem? Again, no, that is not a problem. The moment we gave up that control was also the moment we became relevant. That is the moment, surrendering that control, where we gained national relevance. If we didn't do that, if we didn't get the bill submitted, we never would have stepped onto the field. If we were being attacked, it is because we were seen as a threat. And remember, they don't live in a movie either. They have to deal with chaos, they have to deal with unpredictability, and they have to deal with the wills of the 1,500 people in this room, which are set in direct opposition to their own. Another analogy I have for how we might think about this new situation, this new reality, is surfing. So, who in the room has been surfing? All right, we got a good number. Still the minority, I would say. So for those who have not been surfing, I want to orient you to some of the basics of surfing. The first step to surfing is you shrink wrap yourself in a neoprene suit. Then you grab a big chunk of foam covered in fiberglass, and you walk into the ocean. And remember, the reason you're going to the ocean in the first place is because there are waves, hopefully big waves, and that at least for the first while, those waves are going the opposite direction that you are heading. And so you have to get past those waves, past the point at which they are breaking. You need to get past the breakers. And then once you are past the breakers, there's a lot of waiting around. There's a lot of scanning the surface. And there's a lot of uncertainty. You don't know when that next wave will come, and you don't know if you're going to be able to surf it. So when you see what you think might be a wave coming that maybe you can surf, you need to make a choice. 1, can I catch this? And 2, if I do catch it, will it kill me? If the answer to the first question is yes and the answer to the second question is no, you commit. You lay down on that board and you paddle your butt off and you try and catch it. The other thing that I'd like to point out about surfing is just how hard it is. And I think a good explanation for this is, or a good item for this, is that I was in grad school, this is in California, and I had someone complain to me about Californians. And they were complaining about how Californians present this calm and cool exterior, but they're working really hard. And this person used the analogy of they're like ducks, calm and tranquil, but underneath the surface they're paddling like mad. And this was clearly in a negative sense, but I actually took it as a big compliment. And I would like to think about this in the context of surfers. So if you think about surfers, who in American culture has a dopier surfer stereotype than the surfer dude? Far out, man, let's go shred the gnar, come on, dude. Doesn't speak to, that's dopey. But if you think about this, if you've ever tried surfing, you know that it's very difficult. And if you think about those surfer dudes, they are waking up at 5 a.m. every day to get out and do a very, very physical activity. That takes remarkable persistence, endurance, strength, and discipline. In surfing, you're just gonna get beat up. You are. I mean, remember those waves that are going the opposite direction that you're trying to go. You're going to be cold, you're gonna be rolled by a wave, you're gonna get hit by a board, you might get stung by a stingray, and you might have surfer's drip. And surfer's drip is where hours after you go surfing, water just pours out of your nose. And so, to relay just how inconvenient this can be, I'm gonna give you a hypothetical situation. So let's say you're a young man, first year in grad school. Say you're about 6 feet tall, darker features, and this is a hypothetical. Say you went surfing that morning, and you're speaking with someone you want to make a good impression on. And let's say you just make a really great point. I mean, this is a winner. I mean, it is so insightful. It's on Paul. It is great. And just as you're straightening yourself up to like reflect how awesome and brilliant you are, surfer strip. And so, the only thing you have time to do is to go like this. And the first thought out of your head is, why is there so much empty space in my head? Did it get on my shirt? Did it get on her shoe? And, oh no, is that a booger? Or is it a piece of seaweed? And as you're wondering whether it's worse if it's a booger or a piece of seaweed, you realize that none of it matters because she's walking the other direction. So this is a hypothetical situation that just illustrates the how tough surfing can be. So semi-seriously, because I did just say booger in front of 1,500 people, you're going to get beat up if you surf. So why do people do it? Because it's awesome. They do it because it's awesome, because they have made a choice that this is something that is worth doing, and they're going to work hard every day with extraordinary discipline to do it. I would like to suggest that we are very much like surfers. Everybody in this room has committed, they've decided that the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act is something worth doing, even though it means subjecting ourselves to unpredictability. We don't know when the wave of popular support for climate action is going to finally force Congress to act, and we also don't even know if we're going to be able to ride that wave. But when we see it coming, we are going to make that choice to lay down on our boards and paddle like mad to catch it. We are committed to this, even though this means subjecting ourselves to wills set against our own, those dang stingrays. And we are going to commit ourselves to this, even though it means subjecting ourselves to chaos. As we chain for that wave, a lot of seawater is unexpectedly going to pour out of our nose at the most inopportune times. The point is that we have made a choice that we think is worth doing, even though we have to be disciplined and strong and consistent to even get on the board and past the breakers. Even though, despite that success, we still don't know when the wave will come that carries us to shore, we are going to commit ourselves to paddling like mad to catch it, whether it is now or whether it is later. Even though sometimes the word explaining the virtues of our policy are going to pour out of us like so much seawater, and sometimes we're going to feel like we just left a booger on the shoe of someone we were trying to impress. We're going to do it all again tomorrow. This is hard work. It's a messy system that we need to operate in, for which the script isn't written, but we are here. We got 3 bipartisan bills submitted that are a real match for the scale of the problem. Wills may be set against ours, but our will is set against theirs. They don't live in a movie either. We've been preparing ourselves for consideration of this bill in this Congress or in a Congress to come, and when that wave of popular support comes, my money is on us being able to ride it into shore. Thank you.